Many in the trans community feel that the sooner a child with gender dysphoria begins the transitioning process using puberty blockers, the more likely it is that a trans person would have a more fulfilled and happy life. But recently, the government commissioned Dr. Hilary Cass to review the services provided by JIDS. The Cass report had concerns about gender-affirming care, how the clinic was run and the lack of data collection.
When I was there, what I noticed after a few months of being there was that a child who had been seen 4 times, who I remembered from the clinical team meeting having quite a complex background and some issues around their identity for sure, but he was referred for hormones. And I asked the clinician how many times they had seen him, and they said it was 4. And it was a shocking moment for me because I just felt 4 sessions cannot be long enough to assess any child. And it's certainly not long enough with teenagers, in my opinion. What started to happen around 2015 was that the numbers started to escalate rapidly, and it moved up into the thousands of children. And the staff team grew enormously. But then at around 2018, 2019, I think quite a few of the staff were getting concerned, as I had back in 2004, about children who were being put forward to the endocrine clinic for hormone treatments too rapidly. And ultimately what happened there was that they tried to raise concerns within the team, and then I think they spoke with Dr. David Bell, who wrote a report. But even that was put in front of the governors, and then there was an issue with the governors because what happened was they wanted their own medical officer to do a report, which he did, but he left out significant parts of the testimony from the whistleblowers in the team at the time. And then they were trying to replace Dr. Bell's report with that. And then what followed was that my husband, who happened to be working as a governor, he'd retired from the Tavistock as well, but he was on the board of governors, and he resigned because he felt he couldn't put through the medical officer's report. And really out of that publicity then, obviously, he went into the papers. He was the first clinician who really spoke about it to the press. What I was aware of from the more recent group of whistleblowers, because obviously I've met and talked with some of them as well, is that they did feel very concerned that some of the children did have some internalised homophobia, and that they were struggling with ideas about their sex and their sexual attraction. And so therefore it might have been an easy option in a sense. And I'm not saying it's an easy option, but it seems like a simple solution. Perhaps that's a better way of saying it. There were also concerns that for some parents, culturally, it would be more acceptable to have a trans daughter, for example, than a gay son, or vice versa. So there were definitely real concerns around that. And I think there were concerns generally, I mean, whether people were straight or gay or pretty asexual, which, of course, quite a few of this age group seem to be. They're not really expressing any interest in sex at all, and that's something I see quite a lot even now. But I think it's a case of an identity crisis, and that there's so much that needs unfolding and investigating and talking about with the young person before you ever think, oh, the answer is to give them medications.
Because of the concerns about the long-term side effects and lack of effectiveness, puberty blockers are no longer prescribed by the NHS. This has received quite a bit of criticism by some pro-trans organisations.
When you think about blocking a child's puberty, you're blocking their development. You're not only blocking their sexual development, you're blocking their development on lots of levels, their body development. So when a child takes puberty blockers, let's say they're age 11, and if it's a little boy, their penis won't grow and their body won't masculinize. They won't get bigger shoulders, their jaw won't grow, they won't get any pubic hair. They won't get any erections. They won't get sexual arousal. The same with a little girl. If she has her puberty blocked at 11, Her, vagina obviously doesn't grow, but her hips doesn't grow, her breasts don't grow, her pubic hair doesn't grow, and she doesn't have any sexual arousal. Now, if we could just zero in on the sexual arousal bit for a moment. When you have puberty, it comes in stages, like the kind of the injection of hormones in the body. It's been well documented. So there's an influx, for example, when you're in the fetus, just a small, whether you're a boy or a girl. Then again, when you're about 3, then again around 6 or 7, but then the big one happens at puberty. So it's happening in stages. And when it happens in puberty, it's continuous. It's continuous. And so little girls, for example, they go through crushes. It's the beginning of a sexual awakening. And when you go through these crushes, you are starting to, almost like a little girl who's play acting, being an adult, like having a job, or, you know what I mean? That you're starting to kind of play act, having a pair bond, falling in love and mating as such, which is, evolutionary, arguably, you know what I mean? And I know not everybody mates, I know not everybody has children, but it's arguably what the human is put on earth to do, is to reproduce. I've spoken to, a guy called James Linehan, and he didn't have puberty as a child. He had an intersex condition, and it's called hypogonadism. And so he didn't go through puberty. So when he was at 11, 12, 13, 14, he wasn't having crushes. But not only that, he was utterly childlike, because he didn't have any need to upskill and kind of get on socially, to fall in love, to have boyfriends and girlfriends, to even start a crush on them. He didn't care about them. He wanted to play with his little He-Man figures. And so all the other children in his peer group, they moved on. They were meeting, looking cool, checking out their clothes, developing in all sorts of cognitive and emotional and sexual ways. And it was very interesting because he was quite passive and docile, which is evolutionarily sensible, because children they do what they're told by their old elders. And then comes the teenager who becomes themselves and starts kind of, why? Because they're creating an adult. An adolescent is an adult in construction. And so they're becoming their own person, and they're getting into their likes and their dislikes, their political values. None of that will happen with a puberty blocked child, because they're remaining childlike, not only physically, but mentally and cognitively. We don't know the extraordinary processes that happen between 10 and 20. We see it in the child and the adult, how much they change. And it's all through the process of puberty. And now we are interfering with that process and saying, we can choose in some sort of godlike fashion, we can choose the children that will remain gender dysphoric and will somehow, without a doubt, want to transition when they're 20 and 24. The brain doesn't actually grow in size in puberty. It grows in depth. It gets layers of depth. And not giving a child the opportunity to have that depth, I think, is very invasive, and I'm absolutely against it.
So the government here seems to have favoured a wait-and-see approach to gender dysphoria in teenagers, which brings us to the issue of the conversion therapy bill. One last controversy.
Well, I'm one of the 3 directors of Gay Men's Network, and we're a not-for-profit company, and we established in the wake of the government consultation on the conversion therapy bill. We all know what the old-fashioned conversion therapy was in the 1940s, 50s. That was the barbaric medical practice of electrocuting gay men, or the corrective rape of lesbians, so-called corrective rape of lesbians, with a hope to changing their sexuality. Conversion therapy these days means something quite different, I'm afraid. Campaigners in favour of Conversion Therapy Act or of Conversion Therapy Bill, they say that trans conversion therapy, which is principally their concern, is the practice of a doctor doing anything other than accepting a child's self-diagnosis, which could be at a very young age, that they are in fact the other sex. So it is an attempt to criminalise paediatricians and therapists who do anything else than say to, say, a 13-year-old who's often autistic, they often have comorbidities. It's an attempt to say to a doctor in that situation, you must accept their cross-sex identification or we will prosecute you. It sounds like a good thing. Lots of people want to be in favour of it. But in fact, what it's doing is something quite extraordinary. It's regulating a bit of medical practice and paediatrics, which is quite important, you might think, and it's doing so with the blunt instrument of criminal law.
I very much advocate for people to have therapy, absolutely talking therapy. But when I hear the rhetoric of conversion therapy, that sets me straight away into the mindset that the therapist or the doctor would be intending from the beginning to dissuade that person from their trans identity. I think it is a good thing to have a certain amount of so-called gatekeeping when it comes to medical treatment. Yes, because I read and hear ever more accounts, I'm afraid, of people who do regret or partially regret their transition. But the very concept of conversion therapy strikes a greater fear into my heart.
Indeed, one of the things the Cass report pointed out was that most of the gender questioning teenagers seen at gender clinics were actually same-sex attracted. So having explorative therapy seems essential to avoid the issues of detransitioners.
So after Marcus Evans' resignation in 2019 from the Board of Governors, the Standing for Women organised a meeting with Lord Mooney at the House of Lords, and all sorts of people came from all over the world, actually. And obviously then a network which hadn't existed before from different places. We talked about, well, how could we help improve the medical approach, the care that the children, or the lack of care as we saw it. So after that, a network developed, a mother who was very concerned about her child who was on the waiting list for JIDS, and I put together a judicial review with a lawyer and got a lot of witness statements on there that would all put in a package. You submit it, and then unfortunately, due to my personal circumstances, I couldn't continue. But during that time, I read an article by Joni Walsh about 2 detransitioners, and one of them was Kira, and she talked really movingly about what had happened to her, and essentially, she was a young kid. She now looks back and knows that she probably had homosexual feelings developing, but at that stage she felt very depressed. There were complexities in the background. She was feeling, I think, neglected as a person, a young person, and very confused. And she hit on this idea that she was trans, and she asked to go to the JIDS clinic. And then yet again, after a few sessions, rather than investigating this complex background, talking to her about the depression, maybe investigating with her feelings around her sexuality, they put her on hormones, and then sadly she went on and quite quickly had a double mastectomy, and then in her early 20s realised that she wasn't trans and that it had been a mistake, and had asked her to be a witness on the case. And what we felt was that she would be a very good person to take the case and take it forward. Which she did, which was such a brave decision because she received so much abuse and criticism for that. But she was the face of the judicial review, and what it meant was for the first time the Tavistock actually had to bring their paperwork. They actually had to bring their research, they had to bring their statistics to the court. And then, of course, it became very evident very quickly to the press who were in the courtroom, to the judges, that this was research, and I put that in inverted commas, going on, that really was very experimental, had very little basis to it. And actually, they hadn't even really got any outcomes for it, and they had already lowered the age group down to Tanner stage 2, which could mean that children as young as 9 and 10 were receiving puberty blockers. And it's worth saying that she has to now live with the consequences of that. She will never be able to breastfeed her children if she were to have them. She has had a lot of pain and a lot of health issues, and it's very difficult for her to get treatment because there is no service for detransitioners. They seem to be sort of ejected out of the transition service, and then no one really knows what to do.
Now, I have worked very close with families. I've worked very close with medical professionals, and seeing some of these young people who've gone through their gender-affirming care, working with their parent, working with their practitioner, they make that decision themselves. And I see some very well-adjusted young people who know exactly who they are. And the reality is, when we look at those who have had any form of regret, It's a very, very, very small number, right? Now, I've seen cases where people say they regretted coming out because they actually weren't accepted by their own family. They weren't accepted by school, their work, but they also weren't accepted by the community as well, and they were isolated. So they thought they'd come out and be accepted and be part of this wider community, but at the end of the day, they found further barriers in this community as well, and then they weren't accepted.
Gender-critical campaigners who have fought all their lives for women's or LGBT rights have now been accused of being bigots.
When I used to be on Twitter, because I've left, there was a lot of discussion about being anti-woke, for example, and I think this is really important because woke comes from an anti-racist perspective. To use the term means, at first, comes from anti-racism. And it's true that a lot of anti-racist movements have been infiltrated by transgenderism. I'm not denying that. But a lot of American, particularly gender critical, call themselves anti-woke, also are homophobic, misogynistic, racist, as well as being against transgenderism. And all this is conflating into one thing. You can discuss with an anti-wokeist on social media and talk about women's oppression and they will call you woke. So these people are not at all our friends. In fact, what they are trying to do, and I mean, Trump is prime example of that, is to revert to that traditional conservative version of patriarchy.
Whatever gender critics intend, the fact is that their arguments are being supported by and amplified by misogynists and far-right extremists. If you look at the attacks on trans people and the attacks on trans allies like me, the people making them are neo-fascists, right-wing fundamentalist Christians, and extreme misogynists.
Every parliamentarian who speaks on this subject will now say right-wing forces are behind this growth. Yes. And they actually know us from before. So they know that's not true. They know us from Stonewall days. They know us from other campaigns. We're not party political at all. We're a charity. We've got board of trustees of literally all parties and none. But to say that we're right-wing is so ludicrous when you look at each of us involved in this, certainly at LGBT Alliance, and I think most of our supporters have been campaigners for human rights. Because if you are gay and lesbian, it's almost inevitable because you've experienced what it's like to be the underdog or the figure of derision.
Well, it depends on what they're focusing on. If they're focusing on things like mental health or sexual health of those who are same-sex attracted, within society and the things that are affecting them specifically, that's fine. But when they're actually trying to go and create further division around identity and trying to go and paint people like myself as, something like autogonophilia, or trying to go and say that, kids are really just, homophobic themselves and really just gay or lesbian and not really trans, and trans doesn't exist. Well, that's the problem. That's where the problem exists. And we need to find a way to actually work with each other and actually come to find a common ground. I would be happy to sit down with some of these folks and have that conversation, have them have a peek into the life of someone like myself. I don't have a problem with people wanting to go and look after each other and say LGBT specifically. Great, go do it. That's fine. But, sit down with me, understand my world, understand what I've gone through, and don't sit here and say that, you don't exist and you're actually a mental health disorder. We all know we all know the facts. We all know the truth. It's already been talked about, contested, and changed within the World Health Organization. Let's move on.
Can the two sides of the argument come together?
I worry and am not sure it can be solved. Again, I go back to, I think, the whole kind of no debate line with Stonewall, the jumping on J.K. Rowling when she said the very first things that she said, which were quite mild and, reasonable stuff up for discussion. If you jump down hard on someone at the first voicing of any questioning, people come back out of their boxing corner fighting. and there's not really a referee in the middle saying, cool off people. I often say people erred on the side of inclusion and equality in the sort of the first half of the 2010s, thinking, well, we've got the Equality Act now. The right thing is to be kind, to be nice, to be respectful, to be inclusive of trans people. So they followed the path of inclusion, and they followed the path of respect and tolerance and equal rights, but they didn't follow the path of how do these intersect with other rights, whether that's prison or elsewhere. How do they intersect with sex-based rights? How do they intersect with, religious beliefs? How do they intersect with sexuality? Everyone was considering trans in isolation. Yet one of the duties of the Equality Act, of the public sector equality duty, has always been also to foster good relations between all of the groups that are protected, and to anything that you do to help one group, if it impacts on another group, it must be the minimally impactful thing that you do if it's going to have an impact on another group. This whole thing I used to hear saying, I don't want to be tolerated. I want to be accepted. I want to be included. I want equal rights. Yeah, but equal rights with whom or as whom? You have equal rights as a human being. If you want equal rights with women, well, that's different because theirs is a sex-based right and you have a gender-based right. You have a transition-based right, which are both accepted in law, but they're not equal rights with each other. And some people can't even discuss that without fuming. My only hope is how do we find a way to converse, communicate and coexist, to intersect positively in society. We don't have to agree, that's not the problem, but where it affects questions around safeguarding of women in certain kind of intimate spaces, and where it affects the, making sure that children aren't making adult decisions, then those are questions I think some people should be able to agree to come to the table on to talk about. And to be able to talk about it. But the one thing that's lacking is the ability to kind of talk about these things and still humanize both sides. I've seen a lack of empathy on both sides, a lack of empathy from some trans people around women's concerns, and a lack of empathy from some women around, the literal hell that some trans people with gender dysphoria have been going through their life. And instead simply jump to the assumption that it's a sexual fetish driven by adult desires, when it's something that for many people, they know statistically, happens around, the ages of 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It's not a sexual fetish at that age. You haven't got adult desires. You haven't got access to porn and the internet. You have, these things come later. So I think there's a lack of empathy around the actual dysphoria rather than only seeing it as a kind of sexual fetish. It's the deterioration in language from both sides that has upset me most. The fact that we can't hold a conversation without doing ad hominems at the next person. Every time I say it's a bit of both sides on that, people say, no, it's mainly the other side. But both sides say exactly that. And I've received enough abuse publicly and privately from both sides to know I've experienced it in both sides. There are degrees of difference. Yes, one side isn't yelling threats that include, words like kill or rape. So there's definitely a degree of difference in the language there. But in terms of the anger, in terms of the vehemence and the vitriol, it's horrible at both sides at times.
It's true that biological sex is the main reason why women are oppressed, but not entirely. There are parts of the world where women are oppressed because of the way they speak, act, and dress. In other words, they are gender nonconformists, in a similar way that trans women are gender nonconformists. So this, to me, gives all women, trans and non-trans, a common interest in working together to challenge misogyny and patriarchy. So instead of seeking to always find differences and divisions, we should be trying to find the common ground between trans and non-trans women, so that together they and we can fight misogyny and patriarchy, can fight the gender conformism that oppresses all women, whatever their sex or gender identity. Trans women are not the enemy of other women. The fight by some women against trans inclusion is a distraction from the far more serious fight to protect all women against domestic abuse, rape, unequal pay, and so on. focus on the real enemy, not trans women.
The binary is very damaging at the moment. What you're finding is that this is divisive politics where people are being set against each other. People are talking about losing friends, families not agreeing, splitting up, and so on and so forth. This is not good politics. And as I've said a number of times, what you do is you don't build alliances around what you want. You build alliances around what we want. So it's about the common good. And if that's what politics is about, typically what we've done before is we've built alliances in the centre, we've marginalised the extremes. What is happening at the moment is that the extremes are marginalising the centre, at least they're attempting so to do. And one of the ways they do it is telling people that disagreement is bigotry. And so what people in the centre do is they shut up. Because actually the social sanction for speaking up is too high, and the social praise for being, down that end of the market is too great. So somehow we have to get out of this, because this is ultimately very destructive. And the only way we can do it, I think, is by building moderate centrist views around good solutions. So in the specifics around the lesbian and gay issue, actually we just have to go on arguing on the evidence what is the right solution in terms of health, in terms of sports, in terms of refuges and single-sex spaces and so on and so forth. Let's think about what world we want to live in.
Well, that's given me a lot to think about. Now, personally, I think trans activists have gone too far, and the plus really worries me. All the people I've spoken to would agree that the years of no debate are over. We have to talk. History has shown us things can change very, very quickly. So who knows what the future holds?